So this is part 1 of chapter 15, special senses on the eye. So we're going to talk about eye and vision in this video. So the eye is very sensitive. As humans, we rely a lot on that sensory information. So 70% of all sensory receptors are in the eye, and that's in the retina. Half of our cerebral cortex is involved with processing visual information. Now, not all animals are like that. We are just very visual. And we find the eye in the orbit. We've talked about that in the skull in the past. So, along with the eye, there are the eyebrows, eyelids, the conjunctiva, the tearing apparatus, and the muscles that move the eye so we can position the eye. And these are collectively known as the accessory structures of the eye. We'll talk about them one at a time. So the eyebrow, interesting thing about the eyebrow, people that have lost their eyebrows, like a patient of mine lost his eyebrows and eyelashes due to a pathology, and when all his hair fell out, the pathology is called alopecia. When all his hair fell out, including his eyelashes and his eyebrows, he said one of the things that freaked him out was that in the shower, soap kept on getting into his eyes, that he didn't seem to be able to keep it out. He had to be really careful about that. And so these have got a protective aspect. Your eyelashes, something touches your eyelashes, it makes you blink right away. So you close your eye, it protects your eye. Eyebrows direct moisture, sweat, things like that away from running down into the eye. Tearing over here, the lacrimal means tears. So on the median side, so the carbuncle we'll talk about in a second. The whites of the eyes are collectively called the sclera. The pupil is the opening. This is the iris. The eyelids, the lower and upper eyelid close to protect the eye. The cornea is the clear part of the fibrous coating that covers the iris and pupil. The palpebral fissure is the space between the eyelids. It varies depending on whether you squint or not. The lateral commissure and the medial commissure are the medial and lateral folds collectively. So eyebrows shade the eye and redirect perspiration, water, rainwater, shower, that kind of stuff. Eyelids, we've already talked about here. The lacrimal carbuncle has oil and sweat glands. It's all about lubricating the front of the eye. So there's muscles, only really muscles for the upper eyelid. It's called the levator palpebrae superioris muscle, which does exactly what it says, lifts the eyelid from above, lifts the upper eyelid. Eyelashes initiate the blinking reflex, which I've already said, and there's lubricating glands on the underside of the eyelids that lubricate when you blink. So when we look at it, the eyeball has got this covering here, and that's the conjunctiva. The conjunctiva has two portions. The portion that's on the eyelid, which is called the palpebral conjunctiva, and the part that's on the front of the eyeball, which is called the bulbar conjunctiva. When that gets inflamed, that's what conjunctivitis is all about. The fold in between will catch tears, etc. But we're just going to leave it at that. A lot of people have problems with the conjunctiva. A lot of people get pink eye conjunctivitis. And so knowing those portions are somewhat important. It's all about lubricating and giving a protective covering. It's also transparent. Tearing. Tear ducts and tear glands, lacrimal glands and ducts, not only go into the eye, but they also drain into the nasal cavity. That's why you start sniffing when you're crying. The tears themselves have lubricating property. They're saline solution, but there's also some mucus to help with the lubrication, and some antibodies and lysozymes for any bacteria that are going to get on it. And the tears mostly drain into the nasolacrimal duct in the lacrimal bone and drain into the nose. Like that. That's why, like I say, you sniffle when you're crying, because you're watering the mucus in your nose down. Now, most people don't realize that the lacrimal gland is over here. The lacrimal duct is on the medial side. The extrinsic eye muscles. This is an interesting group of muscles. They move the eye. They are very small motor units. They don't need a lot of force, but they need a lot of precision. So they all originate someplace on the bones at the back of the orbit. And they're narrow little straps, and they attach right to the sclera of the eyeball. There's 6 of them. 4 of them are named rectus. They start at the same spot, and so there's a lateral rectus that moves the eye laterally. There is a superior rectus that moves it superiorly, an inferior rectus that moves it inferiorly, and a medial rectus that moves the eyeball medially. And there's 2 oblique muscles that rotate the eyeball while moving in the vertical plane. So one lets you look up and in, and the other one lets you look out and down. So the superior rectus comes up here, passes through this little tendinous sheath called the trochlea, takes a 90-degree or more turn, and attaches here. So that when you pull on this, it rotates the eyeball so that you end up looking down and laterally. So that's the superior rectus, makes you look down and laterally. The inferior rectus, the superior oblique. I didn't mean rectus. The superior oblique. The inferior oblique attaches here, and it rotates the eyeball this way and makes you look up and medially. So you look up towards your nose. That's inferior oblique. And so this is just looking from a superior view. Now, these things are innervated by 3 cranial nerves. The lateral rectus by the abducens nerve, cranial nerve 6, and the superior oblique by the trochlear nerve, cranial nerve 4, and all of the rest of them are oculomotor nerve 3. And the actions are these. I've just already talked about those actions. So the eyeball itself, there's 3 layers. Seems like three layers is a very common thing in anatomy. There's a fibrous outer layer, there's a vascular middle layer, and then there's a sensory inner layer. They're hollow, but the cavities are filled with fluids, and those are called humors. We'll talk about them in a second. There's 2 cavities. There's an internal cavity, or an anterior and a posterior cavity. And they have different properties and different humors in them. So when you look at it, the sclera is the fibrous outer part here. And then right about here, the fibrous outer part, the sclera, becomes transparent, and that becomes the cornea. Now, this is all really collagen fibers. It is a very dense connective tissue. The next layer in here is the choroid layer, and this is where the vascularization is. There's a couple of important parts of the choroid I'll talk about in a second. And then the inner layer here, which is really the retina, is the sensory layer here. This part of the chamber is filled with a very thick liquid called the vitreous humor. And out here in front of the lens is the aqueous humor. This is the lens that refracts the light. This here is the iris that adjusts the size of the pupil, the aperture of the pupil, as it were. The lens changes shape, and it's pulled on by these suspensory ligaments, and those are attached to ciliary muscles, and so that you can change the focus of the lens. Way easier to do when you're younger. This is the optic nerve that leaves. It's a sensory nerve, cranial nerve 2. It leaves the eyeball here. This area here is the optic disc. There is no sensors right in front of that, so we call it the blind spot. Right here is the macula, and this is where acute vision happens. This is where you do your reading and focus on things. The macula lutea, the central part is called the fovea centralis, and this is for high definition viewing. The rest of it isn't so much. So, 2 regions of the fibrous layer, as I've just pointed out. Sclera, opaque, it's white, it anchors the extrinsic eye muscles and gives the eyeball its shape. So that's the sclera. The cornea is the transparent bit. It bends the light, it refracts light as it comes through. It helps with focus. There are sodium-potassium pumps in the endothelium that maintain the clarity of the cornea. And there's all kinds of pain receptors. When you touch your eyeball, you'll feel them if you touch the cornea. The vascular layer, like I say, most of it's the choroid. It's it's the posterior part of the vascular layer. It supplies blood to both the sclera and the inner layer. It's pigmented to make the inside of the eyeball dark. People that are albinos don't have the pigment in this layer, and that's why their eyes look pink, because light is reflected back out, and it happens to be on the red wavelength. So, and it's much more difficult for them to have visual acuity because of it, because light reflects within the eye due to that lack of pigment. The ciliary body is part of this vascular layer, and it surrounds the lens. And there's the ciliary muscles, which are smooth muscles that I've already talked about them a little bit. You don't need to know a lot, except that it's they are smooth muscles that you can voluntarily change. And they control the shape of the lens. And an important place, something that happens in the ciliary body, is that there are capillaries there that secrete the fluids that for the humors. Now, whether you may realize this already, but probably most of you don't, the humors are constantly being changed. The fresh liquids are constantly being secreted, and the older stuff is constantly being reabsorbed, because these humors carry oxygen and nutrients and are very involved with the health of the eye. As now, most of that is done in the rest of the vascular layer, but this is where the aqueous and vitreous humor come from. And I talked about the suspensory ligaments already. The iris is the colored part of the eye. It's the part that changes, widening or narrowing the pupil. So your pupils constrict if the light is bright or you're looking at something close. If you're looking at something distant or the dim light, the pupils dilate. But they also dilate and constrict with sympathetic and parasympathetic stimulation, so emotional state can do it. So it looks like this. There's two layers of smooth muscle that constrict and dilate the pupil. And you've all seen that happening to people. The sensory layer is called the retina. This is where transduction happens, where the light energy is transformed into neurological signals that we can interpret. Two layers of it. One layer, the outer layer, is pigmented, and it's a light-absorbing layer. It prevents light from scattering, and so that images can be more sharply defined. It needs vitamin A. That's why the joke is, eat carrots, improves your eyesight. You very much need it, vitamin A, for this to work properly. The inner layer is the neural layer. This is where the photoreceptors are. They do the transduction of light energy, and they transmit the signals to the optic nerve. So when we look at it, This is the retina here. This is the sclera. Is the choroid here. And then the retina is thicker than you may think compared to the choroid. So there's a pigmented layer. And then there is the sensory layer here. Something that may throw you a little bit, the rods and cones that sense the light are located out towards the periphery, and the nerves that transmit it all are located more towards the center. So the light actually has to pass through the nerves before it reaches the ones that are sensitive to light. So I already mentioned, and I'm not going to get too deep into the ganglion cell axons, but they run along the inner surface of the retina, and they coalesce to become the optic nerve. And the optic disc is the blind spot. So if we look at it up close, the ganglion cells, these are neurons. They're called ganglions because the cell bodies are not in the central nervous system. There are cells that join them together and help as processors. But we basically have the rods and cones, which are the light receptors here. Way more rods than cones. We'll talk about it in a second. Right? And these bipolar cells here are really the sensory neurons. So this is the axon. These are the dendrites. These synapse with the receptors, and they release a neurotransmitter here to the ganglion cells, which become the optic nerve. These are really the first order sensory nerves here as part of the retina. So rods, way more numerous. They are for dim light. They're non-color. They're just kind of a black and white. It's the ones that we rely upon. This is our night vision. They don't need a lot of light in order to work. Cones, on the other hand, are found really in the macula. That's where they're most concentrated, towards the center of the macula. They're bright light, and they're high acuity, and they're color vision. So the blood supply is very important. And one of the things that's interesting is there's an artery and a vein that pass through the optic nerve, if you see it back here, and the central vein, and it supplies the inner 2/3. So all of those neurons and the ganglion cells and the bipolar cells, and the chorion, the choroid, supplies the rods and cones. Now you can imagine how much ATP these things require, because to run the sodium-potassium pump, like all nerves. So very highly vascularized. One of the interesting things is that you can actually see this when, especially if you put a mydriatic in, but you look into somebody's eyes and you can see these blood vessels. And a lot of times by seeing these blood vessels, you can see the effects of high blood pressure. You can see little balloonings of these things. You can see vascular disease, systemic vascular disease, in these blood vessels when you look into the eye. So the lens and the ciliary separates the anterior and posterior chambers in the eye, like this. Anterior with the aqueous humor, it's more watery. The lens here, vitreous humor in this posterior segment. So the vitreous humor transmits light, but supports the inside of the lens. It keeps the lens in place, holds the retina against the pigmented layer. So it creates pressure. So the eyeball is blowing up like a balloon, except it's the vitreous humor that does it. So in the anterior segment, we have, and the reason we use the word segment instead of chamber, although oftentimes, and I'm very guilty of it, I call the whole thing the anterior chamber, and call it the anterior chamber has an anterior portion and a posterior portion, but more correctly now, it's anterior segment with anterior chamber and posterior chamber of that. But when we look back at this, we'll see that this is the anterior chamber of the anterior segment, and then in here is the posterior chamber of the anterior segment. So it's still in front of the lens, and it still contains aqueous humor, but it's separate by the iris. So between the cornea and iris is anterior, between the iris and the lens, posterior. So the fluid continually filtered from capillaries in the ciliary process, and it drains out the scleral venous sinus, where the sclera and the cornea join. Supplies nutrients and oxygen to the lens and the cornea. Removes waste. I've already kind of mentioned this. Glaucoma is if you don't drain the aqueous humor as fast as you make it. So it basically does this. Right here is where it's made. It flows up here through the posterior chamber of the anterior segment, flows through the pupil, and then fills this, and it drains out this venous sinus there, constantly being made and reabsorbed. The lens itself, biconvex, it's made of elastic fibers. It's avascular. It's epithelium. So it's not connective tissue, but it's rather it's epithelium. As we age, the lenses become less elastic and less able to change. If the lens clouds up, it's called a cataract. So aging, diabetes, smoking, frequent exposure to intense sunlight or intense radiation, glass blowers, people that work in furnaces, things like that, tend to have cataracts. Cataracts look like this, a clouded lens. So that's it for the eye.